So great. We have a lot of new faces too. I'm very excited. Thank you all for being here. I'll be quickly sharing a couple of slides, and I'm very excited to hear Kris's talk. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Happy May. Thank you for those who were able to join our anniversary celebration meeting last month. It's really, looking back at the past year, it's been so amazing. I sound a little like a mom, but I'm so proud of our group, really, and all we have accomplished in 1 year. And this is such a special group, really. Every time we talk, we exchange knowledge and project ideas. And I'm reminded how special this group unique is in its generosity, it's in kindness, it's in the spirit of openness and collaboration. And thank you so much for being here. So today I'll be giving some updates and opportunities for our group, and then we'll be hearing from Dr. Kris de Meyer on his work around how to leverage neuroscience for climate action. And if we have some time, we'll be also having some strategy discussions as well. I always start with kind of this picture, but updating all the numbers and the maps because it's really incredible to me what a global multidisciplinary network this is, with coming from 42 different countries, 181 members from a variety of fields, anywhere from climate science to economy to neuroscience and more. And if you're new to our group, or it's your first time joining, or it's been a while, please introduce yourself on the chat and welcome. We're very excited to have you as part of our group. Okay, so some group updates. One, I would like to congratulate Professor Agustin Ibanez. He is the director of Latin American Brain Health Institute. He's also a professor in Dublin. His work is around looking at environmental, socioeconomic factors impacting brain health and brain aging. He was recently recognized as the top neuroscientist in Chile by Research.com. And we just heard that he was also leading this grant proposal by European Commission called ClickBrain, looking at bringing different institutes and different fields together, look around to bringing around the environment and brain health. And our group was part of that grant proposal too, and we just learned this morning it got accepted, got awarded. So we're very excited for the next steps, and I'll be talking more about this project in the later meetings. Next is Julie Hiramoto. She's an architect working at the intersection of brain health, climate change, and built environment. She had presented in our February meeting, and she was recently recognized by the US Green Building Council as a social community impact asset for her works around really being a champion of brain health and the built environment. So congratulations to her as well. And I also wanted to recognize our sister organization, Niche Neurologists Interested in Climate and Health. These incredible four neurologists, Ali Saad, Larry Young, Beth Marlowe, and Brett Andrews, they had started this community of and group of neurologists really interested in this intersection of how climate change affects our brains, and have been doing a lot of advocacy work, especially around with the American Association of Neurologists, trying to make them recognize climate change as a brain affecting factor and so on. And they had a great representation and presentations at the annual AAN meeting. That was a big success. And both Larry and Ali will be speaking in July for our meeting on some of their work around this area too. Next up, I want to share this very exciting paper that that was written by Boriana, Klaus, Kim, and their team around neuroscience and climate action, with looking at the pathways of, this was a great paper looking at the pathways of brain and planetary health. And I think Kris's talk today will be also pointing to some of the discussion points that they had in their paper. I highly recommend checking it out. I'll be sending out the paper during our follow-up email. Similarly, The group led by Jyoti Mishra at UCSD, they had their paper on fire brain, as it's called, looking at how climate trauma, such as wildfires, impact the cognitive effects and decision making in the people who experience these traumatic climate events. She had presented this work back in December to our group, and now this is out. And I highly recommend you guys reading it and referencing. It's a very important paper in thinking about what climate trauma does to our brains and our cognition. And next, I want to also highlight a paper Professor Josh Carlson from University of Northern Michigan and I had written around this was a perspective paper around the neurobiology of climate anxiety. The Professor Carlson had presented his work back in January, if I remember correctly, around this work of where in the brain climate anxiety exists and how we can leverage the tools we know in neuroscience to be able to mitigate this work. And this perspective has been getting a lot of attention, and we are also a lot of, especially around organizations that are focusing on mental health and climate, such as the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and so on, have been in touch with me to be able to see if they can bring more awareness to this work and really understanding neurobiology of climate anxiety. Some opportunities for our group. So I want to first mention the Hot Brain Conference. This is an annual conference. The third one will be happening in May 20th. It's organized by Professor Sanjay Sisodia at University of College London. And you can register it and watch it virtually, or if you're in the vicinity, if you live in London, I highly recommend attending this meeting. It's a whole day event and they have great speakers. And Dr. Sadias really have been the champion of climate and brain for many years. And this is a really great conference to check out. I also wanted to mention again our subgroup that is led by Dr. Pooja Sahni in India. This is the South and Southeast Asia Neuro Climate subgroup. This group, so far, they have members from Malaysia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and more. And they had their first project proposal submitted, looking at the effects of air pollution and heat on children's cognitive abilities, and they have some more writing projects and so on. It's a really great group. If you have connections, if you are based in Southeast Asia, please contact Pooja. I'll be putting all this information in our follow-up email, but please consider being part of this subgroup. Also, our pediatric nephrologist colleague Shazia Adalet had created a working group around climate, kidneys, and cognition. She had presented her work a couple of months ago, really interested in how both the brain and the children, especially with the chronic kidney disease, are more prone to effects from climate change and how their cognition is relatedly impacted. So this is a working group that's also building right now. So if you have any interest, if you have any work related to that, I recommend checking that out also. And also just wanted to bring out again, Kim had presented about this project that they are building, the Hot Cognition project, if I remember correctly, Kim. But I'll be sending again more information because this is a really, really cool project. And I think that you guys are always open to having more people join you or learn about it. And there's a website related to it, right? Kim, I'm going to leave it up to you, right?
More the merrier.
Great.
I'll post the website in the chat.
Thank you. And finally, another project that we're slowly bringing together is called the Global Resilient Brains Project. This is a kind of a brainchild of Professor Yoko Nomura at CUNY and mine, thinking about different ways, understanding how our brains can be more resilient to climate stressors. And the project will be bringing together different geographies. We have so far members interested from Malaysia, Japan, Turkey, Egypt, and more in Chile, thinking about different layers from anthropological to mechanistic and molecular levels to epidemiological population levels, how certain communities may be more resilient and what we can learn from it. Yes, these are some of those really great groups and projects that are coming up that I recommend checking out. Um, Also, I just want to put it out there in our commerce strategy discussions last month, Boriana had recommended that we have some more social media, a LinkedIn group perhaps, and a Blue Sky account and so on. If anybody is interested in leading those efforts, I would really appreciate it. Please keep get in touch with me. So it would be great to have some social media presence as well and newsletters, maybe. Who knows? We can go crazy. The next thing we want to talk about is something we had mentioned in our last meeting. Dr. Ilan Ohayon and I had recently signed a book contract for an edited volume with MIT Press around this green and ecological neuroscience, basically reimagining neuroscience beyond the neurocentric views and looking into more different ways, seeing brain as an ecosystem and shaped by environmental, social, economic, and other factors, and really thinking of through an interdisciplinary framework. Um, we have been tapping and will be tapping more of our colleagues to be involved with this and write some chapters for us. We're thinking about 20 chapters or so, looking first the more inner environment, so how our immune systems or other types of bodies, our brains and bodies are are related, but then also looking at the built environments. So we're looking for architect colleagues. Thinking about artificial environments. We're looking at the ecology and natural environments and biodiversity aspects, but also social and creative brain of reimagining neuroscience for about 20 chapters total written by our colleagues. And we really want it to be an interdisciplinary integration. So if you're an architect, if you're a clinician, if you're a social worker, you're all invited to submit a chapter proposal. And we're looking for it to be focusing on some facts, but also actionable solutions and hope. And we're looking for not only academic pieces, although this will be mostly an academic paper, but book. We're also looking, it could be an artistic piece that you want to, maybe a drawing, or it could be also narrative pieces coming from lived experiences. Personal narratives are also accepted. And we are encouraging international submissions, especially from lower middle income countries as well. And this will be that was one of the big points that we had with Elan, was to try to make it open access publishing. So this will be there'll be paper books available, but it will be also completely open access for any institution, any library to be able to have access to it and be able to read it. Some timelines on that. We'll have an informational webinar. We're kind of building this very simple website for it on June 10th. And then we'll have chapter proposal submission deadline July 10th. We'll be looking into and selecting the chapters for the first volume, at least on July 31st. And then we'll be expecting our chapter submissions around September 30th. And the publication will be late 2026. So if this looks like something you're interested in, you want to be involved with more information coming on. And we really hope that this group is really the right people to be able to write this book all together, because it's all our efforts together. Ilan, did I miss anything? Do you want to add anything?
No, you did a great job as always.
Thank you.
But everybody come June 10th, and we're open to new ideas and things that we've missed so far. So definitely a warm invite to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll be putting on the website, and I'll be sharing that all the chapters we're already thinking, or chapter sections we're thinking. And yes, all new ideas. We were just two people thinking about this. So if 150 people can do an amazing more job of really expanding the vision of this book. So we look forward to your thoughts about it. Another project I want to talk about that I briefly mentioned in our last meeting is this collaboration we are building with the World Health Organization. They have these training modules that are designed looking at air pollution and health, that are training toolkits for public health workers, for community health workers, for physicians and clinicians all around the world. They create these modules to be a way to educate, raise awareness, and prepare for emergencies for healthcare settings across the world. And they are really interested in creating a training module really focusing on air pollution and brain and mental health. So they're looking for, so we're starting this collaboration with them. And if you are someone who is working at this intersection of air pollution and brain health, especially you have some evidence or case studies or so on, please get in touch with me so we can make sure to include them and have your contributions to this great collaboration we're having with World Health Organization. And then in the next coming meetings, we are at the talks with Wellcome Trust and Clean Air Fund. They're really interested in expanding their research portfolio, looking at climate change and brain health and air pollution and brain health. And I'll be talking more about that, but they're really interested in funding and providing some discretionary funding for some of the projects around this. So there could be some great opportunities for our groups as well. All right. That's all for the opportunities. Thank you for your patience. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Kris de Meyer today. He's a neuroscientist and is a director of the University College London's Climate Action Unit, and he's a research fellow in neuroscience at King's College London. He specializes in how people become entrenched in their beliefs and how this leads to polarization in society and how to overcome this. And Kris works with environmental scientists and policymakers and conservation NGOs to support them in communicating more constructively about controversial environmental topics, which includes climate change. He is a core member of the Challenging Radical Uncertainty in Science.
Hello?
Yes, Science Society, Science Society and Environment Network, funded by the EPSRC and of the UCL Policy Commission for Communicating Climate Science. He's also the producer of the award-winning documentary Right Between Your Ears, exploring the neuroscience and psychology of entrenched views. I really have to check that out. It sounds really interesting. And co-creator of children's radio series Climate Explorers. I definitely have to check that out for my children, Kris. It sounds really interesting. And the participatory theater piece, The Justice Syndicate. He regularly speaks on BBC Radio and TV about polarization in society and why fake news can be so believable. One of Kris's interests lies in how we believe, how our brains decide that certain ideas are true, while rejecting other ideas as false. So I'm really interested in you combining these insights from neuroscience and psychology and how belief happens and how we can use it for climate action and communicating climate change. Thank you, Kris. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm looking forward
All
to
right. Thank you very much. It was interesting to hear that bio. It's a couple of years old now, and some of the projects I'd almost forgotten about that we got involved in them. So I'm very happy to be here. I've been following a couple of previous sessions whenever I can. I joined Puchin. You reached out to me in December or January or something, and that's when I became aware of the work that you guys are doing. And I'm very happy to be talking to you today because I rarely get to talk to neuroscientists and people working in the psychological behavioral sciences anymore. I speak most of the time to climate professionals these days. So very happy to be here today. When I say here sciences of brain, mind, and behavior, I am very like non-boundary. For me, there's a continuum. And so whenever you hear me use the term behavioral science or neuroscience, I generally mean all of them. All of the ways that we try to make sense of what makes people tick are for us insights that we try to put to use to then get society to become better at acting on climate change. So, aims of today. I have two aims. I couldn't make up my mind which one I wanted to do more, so I'm going to try to do a bit of both. The first one is because I heard in previous conversations the challenge that you guys have in getting policymakers to react to the information that you're generating with your research. I am going to cover a little bit about how we are using these insights from neuroscience, psychology, behavioral sciences to work with policymakers and then to create that policy impact for the important work that you're all doing. And then the second piece is more on the research side in sort of like the behavioral component of how people are responding to climate change. And here the question is, how can we activate and reshape climate relevant research in neuroscience, psychology, behavioral sciences to leverage them more than is happening currently? I think we're missing quite a bit in how much we can get out of these sciences that are all dear to our heart in the fight against climate change. Right. So very quickly, Borchin mentioned it that some of my background, the way in for me was in this entire question was for me the neuroscience of polarization. I started to look at that about 25 years ago. And in those days, climate change wasn't polarized. So we were fighting with each other about other things, 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. Those kind of things were the big breaking points in society back then. And then somewhere along the line, climate change became more and more polarized and polarizing. And that's when it started to take up more and more of the work that I was doing. And these days, we describe what we do as using insights from neuroscience, psychology, and systems thinking to change how professionals and organizations talk, think about, and act on climate change. So most of our work is with people who, in a professional context, have to work on climate change. Whether they sit in a policy space or in a civil society organization or in an NGO, it doesn't matter. They're trying to do something different. They're trying to take action. They're trying to get other people to take action. This is where we are trying to mobilize these insights from our sciences. We've got 3 priority areas. Very quickly, climate risk is where we are trying to improve how information about the risks of climate change, including the health risks, the stuff that many of you are working on, drive better decisions in policy and business. There is not a direct line between the two, as we'll be discussing today, but there are ways to make facts and evidence to translate that into better policy. And that's one of the domains that we're working in. Then in the climate stories domain, it is where people, where society at large is telling stories about climate change in the media, in the arts, in the conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis, and that's our climate stories domain. And then the climate action domain is where we help organizations to deliver climate positive action relevant to their context. And that is for a government department, might be something that they need to do. For an NGO, it's something that they try to do. So it's very, very context specific and very broad that we are thinking about climate action here. 3 examples of projects before I go into more detail. I thought maybe it would be good to show the kinds of things that we are doing to help you understand the breadth of this. So about a year and a half ago, we designed a meeting for the UK government, and that meeting brought together 170 scientists and policymakers from 65 different nations to talk about how can we make the IPCC more relevant to policymakers, because the people in government departments that need to work with the outputs of the IPCC are saying it's not usable for us. We can't really do much with it. So we then brought the scientists and policymakers together to tackle that question together. And this is an example of using insights from neuroscience psychology. We use our insights to design the interaction that we're creating between the scientists and the policymakers. And the aim then really is to improve that science policy co-production, the collaboration at the boundary of policy and science. An example from the climate stories domain is that we do a lot of training of journalists and professional storytellers, and what we are teaching them is how to tell stories of action about climate change, not stories about the problem of climate change. And the reason why we have that focus will become clear in some of the things that I will say later. And this is an example of how we are trying to change the mix of climate stories that society is exposed to, moving from an issue-based to an action-based conceptualization of stories. And the picture of the person on the screen here is she's Audrey, the climate editor of France TV, the national broadcaster of France. She came to one of those trainings. She then was given the responsibility to redesign the editorial strategy on how to report about climate change for the French broadcaster. And she brought that action storytelling in as an important component of it. She now has a news desk of 10 journalists who are looking for stories of what communities in France are doing to tackle climate change, rather than just the doom and gloom stories. And then the third one is an intervention with policymakers, and it's a kind of interactive experience that we developed together with theater makers. And we think of it as a virtual gym for policymakers to allow them to practice how to pull the policy levers of taxation, regulation, and subsidies, which are policy levers which they know how to use. They just don't know how to use them to drive the clean energy revolution. They will know how to use them in an energy crisis situation in a way that benefits fossil fuel companies, for example, but they don't really understand how they can drive that transition towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. And this was a project designed to overcome lack of agency, knowing how to act among policymakers. We'll come back to that term later on. You might be really surprised that that is a thing that is a problem, but it is the biggest problem that we are running into. People not knowing how to take action in the context that they're sitting in. So why are we taking this approach? So first of all, is the Neuro Climate Working Group focus flipped around more or less. Most of the talks that I have listened to from your group is on how climate change affects the brain. And of course, that is super, super important. But there is a flip side to that story, and that is how the brain affects climate change. And there's a very superficial answer to that, which is, well, humans are causing it, and it's our greed and our stupidity and all of these. That's just a very superficial layer. There is much more going on in research in different branches of psychology, neuroscience, behavioral sciences that can really help us dig into all the nuances of our brains affecting climate change or causing climate change. Moving on from here, I'm going to do this by talking specifically about 3 focus points in our work. Focus 1, delivery rather than discovery science. Focus 2, upstream interventions, professional capacity building. And then focus 3, an action first rather than a knowledge first approach to building interventions. I'll go into detail in each of these. So delivery science, what do I mean with that? In the late 90s, Jane Lubchenco, who was an ecologist in the US, took over the presidency of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And when she became the president, she gave a speech in which she said, you know, as an ecologist, I know what is coming down the line. I know lots of problems to do with biodiversity and nature and climate change are just waiting around the corner for us. And within that context, we as scientists are really going to have to think about our role in society. What are we there for? Are we there for to discover new facts about the world, or are we there for to help the world respond to these big challenges that are coming our way? And she framed that as science needs to form a new social contract with society. Now, by the end of 2019 and then the beginning of 2020, she then did a session at the American Geological Union, which is the big conference that brings all of the geologists and climate scientists together, where she revisited her social contract from 22 years before. And then they wrote it up in a paper. And I'm going to just read one or a few lines from this because it's really important for why our focus is on delivery over discovery. So she says that much has changed in the 2 decades since I proposed that scientists should re-examine their obligations to society in order to serve society better. Today, more environmental scientists are actively sharing their science broadly, conducting use-inspired science in addition to basic science, engaging with society and crafting solutions to problems, not just diagnosing them. And you guys are all evidence of this. The fact that this network exists, the fact that you are meeting, you are the signs that this is happening. Now, she also said in that same speech and paper is that, you know what, don't be fooled. For the most part, this is because scientists have taken on these extra duties because they believed it was the right thing to do. And despite the considerable impediments that exist within academia, make no mistake, the culture of academia continues to impede progress. So all of us have done that on the backlog of all of the other work that we need to do as scientists. We've taken on that effort to make our science count in society. And there is something to note here specifically. I know that many of you are health professionals, and there is a real difference in discovery and delivery between the health and environmental sciences. In the health sciences, there often is a clear linkage between discovery science and delivery science, because we've created systems that are set up to turn discovery into health benefits. And one very simple example of that, well, one very complicated example of that is the clinical trial pipeline that links preclinical research to treatments on the market. So we've built an entire machinery that takes some basic research and turns it into a health benefits for the public. And there are other ways in public health and so on where that kind of machinery has been built up in the health space. In the environmental and climate sciences, these systems do not exist. There are no systematized ways to turn scientific discoveries into benefits for society. And whatever systematic attempts exist at the moment, they aren't very effective. The IPCC, the EPIS, which is the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC, aren't very effective in turning scientific discovery into benefits for society. They're trying very hard, but it's not working that well. This has a side effect for the work that you guys are doing. There's a natural outlet for climate and health work towards health policy. There's virtually no outlet towards climate policy. Let me give you one example. If you are working, for example, on understanding heat effects on epilepsy, which I know that neuroscientists, neurologists are doing. So how does heat affect the incidence of epilepsy? Then it will be relatively straightforward for you in a certain country as a scientist to work with the health authorities to get a kind of health policy to deal with the impacts of climate change on people with epilepsy. So for example, if you happen to live in a wealthy country, then you might be able to get air conditioning paid back by the National Health Service or by health insurance sometime in the future if you can really establish the effects of heat on epilepsy. But there is no way that you can take your research about heat effects on epilepsy and turn that into positive climate policy. That is super, super, super difficult. So that's what I mean with that you will find an easier outlet for your work on the health side than on the climate side. Doesn't mean of course we need it, we need to create it, but at the moment it doesn't really exist. So a lot of the work that we do is about how we create that. Okay, let's go to our second focus, which is on upstream interventions building professional capacity. And I'm going to perhaps ruffle a few feathers, but I do want to put this out here because it's important to define what I mean with upstream interventions. So one of my theses, one of the theses of that sits behind the work that we are doing is that behavioral sciences have been focusing on individual behavior change and that has had modest results to date. The paper that I'm going to show, you may have come across that. It may have ruffled your feathers. Hold fire when I explain why it is important. So this was a paper by two behavioral economists, Nick Chater and George Lowenstein. And in 22, they wrote this paper, which when they first released it, was framed as the mea culpa paper. It was like, hey, finally, these behavioral economists are admitting that they have been focusing on something that doesn't really work very well. And what they said was that the fact that behavioral sciences, or at least their branch of the behavioral sciences, behavioral economics, had been focusing on the individual level solutions had really dire consequences for behavioral public policy. And here's just one short paragraph from what they said. An influential line of thinking in behavioral science, to which the two authors have long subscribed, is that many of society's most pressing problems can be addressed cheaply and effectively at the level of the individual, without modifying the system in which the individual operates. We now believe this was a mistake. Along with, we suspect many colleagues in both the academic and policy communities. Results from such interventions have been disappointingly modest, but more importantly, They have guided many, though by no means all, behavioral scientists to frame policy problems in individual, not systemic terms. So it's not saying that it hasn't worked. They say it has worked to some degree. The results are modest. But what the more important thing, a side effect that it has had, is that we have focused our efforts on that individual behavior change, and we haven't thought about the systemic change that needs to happen to allow individuals to change their behavior. And that's what they call the S frame, the systems frame, basically. Now, around the same time, in the UK again, a report was released by the Behavioral Insights team, which again sort of like related to the nudge version of behavioral science. And for the first time, they were moving away from this idea of doing individual behavior change. And they said, actually, if you are trying to do individual behavior change, you can think of that in terms of this flow analogy, this stream analogy, as trying to make downstream change. And that amounts, if your system is stacked against the change that you want people to make, so if you're trying to get them to switch away from a fossil fuel car, but all of the subsidies or all of the costs are aligned against that, it's really difficult to make people change their behavior. It is as if you're standing along the side of the river and you're just shouting at people, swim harder, when the stream is dragging them in a certain direction. And they said there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit waiting in more upstream interventions, where we are trying to change the conditions in which people make their decisions. And so redirecting the flow of that river so that people can swim with the current rather than against the current might be a thing that we are missing at the moment. Now, their report was also then made some suggestions for what the kind of policy interventions could be. And those were so controversial for the government in charge at that moment that within 12 hours of the report being published, they pulled it from the website. Luckily, some people had saved it, so it's still available. But it really wasn't a story that the politicians, the political party at that time, the Tories, wanted to the public to hear. But very important as an analogy for us to think about, like we're constantly thinking about how do we push our interventions more and more upstream in the system. So that brings us to our explanation of our second focus point here. So what we know is that virtually nobody is thinking of how to use the sciences of brain, mind, and behavior to build the capacity of professionals to make upstream intervention in the system. We know that there are some aspirations to that. I know that some of the papers that you were co-authors on, some of you, are saying, hey, maybe we should also look in this direction, but there isn't yet an established practice there. When I recently did a bit of literature review on this, I found only one paper from 2014 that was trying to survey what kind of knowledge exists that would help us to understand how senior government and business decision makers are thinking about climate change and are thinking about their role in changing the system and in making climate change happen. And that's that one paper that you see the screenshot of here. On the delivery science side, on how to then use these insights from psychology, neuroscience, and so on, to then help people in society make the change happen, we don't see anyone do what we do. It may be that there are other organizations that are doing similar things, but we haven't met them yet. So if you know of them, let us know, but we don't see anyone do what we do. And I'll explain in a second in more detail what that is, basically. So what's that gap in professional capacity that we run into all of the time? So a sentence we hear a lot in workshops with policymakers or people working in business or finance or media is stop telling us how bad a situation is. We already know. Start telling us what we can do about this. And these aren't the ones that are denying that climate is changing and that it's going to be very serious. But there are a lot of people convinced that it's a problem, convinced that it's going to get really bad. And if you're a policymaker and you have your 11th briefing on climate risk in a month, you might really be fed up with that. And you might want someone to start telling us what you can do about the problem. And so we hear similar sentences from politicians, policymakers, scientists, professionals in business, finance, and media. We don't know how to do more than we're already doing. Now, that not knowing how to take action is basically a lack of agency. So professionals we work with often experience a lack of agency. And agency here is a term that Alfred Bandura, who was a social psychologist, who was active from the 1950s till the 2024 when he passed away, or 23. He came up with social cognitive theory, and for him, agency has a very important role in that knowing how to take action to bring about a certain goal. So a lot of the professionals that we are working with lack that agency in the face of climate change. They often have a lack of ability to understand and deal with opposing perspectives, with people who are not agreeing with them. They have a lack of ability to collaborate across silos of expertise. They might work nicely in their sector or with people that are similar to them, but then they go and talk to someone with a different area of expertise and it breaks down, the communication breaks down. And so often they have a lack of ability to change the system around them, to think of their organization, their sector, and how can I make change happen in the system such that we can start making better decisions. And the really flabbergasting thing is that in their professional area of expertise, they have mountains of agency. They just don't have that agency when it comes to climate change. We saw that so crystal clear when we did an intervention with directors in a big engineering company. They all had massive amounts of agency when it came to the ethos of the company, which was doing the best for our clients. But when we asked them, what does it mean to do the best of for your clients against the backdrop of climate change, they drew a blank. They didn't know how to respond to that. So that's why our professional upstream interventions are very much focusing on helping them with practical insights that help them to understand what makes people tick so that they can understand different perspectives and different ways that people make sense of things. We build their capacity to collaborate across silos. We've run projects where we literally put one person from a university together with a person from local government, and then we supported them in resolving certain climate challenges. And then we also do a lot of capacity building to help them to see how they can change the system around them. A little bit on this understanding what makes people tick. So the people who work on climate change are usually non-experts in the sciences that we are experts in. And they need, for the scientific insights from our sciences to be useful to them, we need to translate them into non-disciplinary language, non-disciplinary insights. We can't come with more scientific evidence to them and say, hey, look at this wonderful evidence here. No, we need to really turn that into delivery science and translate it for them. And if we were to look at how this is happening in nutrition science and nutrition advice and healthy eating advice, that pipeline exists. There are nutrition scientists who do basic research. Then there are nutritionists who turn that into advice for people on healthy eating. And that then translates all the way into something like the Healthy Eating Cookbook for Busy People, where it's really boiled down to very practical, tangible, actionable recipes for people. And we don't have that pipeline from the sciences of brain and mind to actionable advice for climate professionals. So I want to talk you through one example of the way that we are trying to build that pipeline. So we're trying to fill that gap with making that translation possible. And we've got 8 insights that we are using to bridge that gap. And I'm going to talk about one of them, Ginger the dog. So this is Ginger the dog. And here we have who Ginger is. So for those of you who can't see the screen very well, this is a cartoon of a man berating his dog in very long sentences. And then at the bottom panel, we see what the dog hears is blah, 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 Ginger, blah, blah, blah. It's a Far Side cartoon, highly recommended. Far Side as a source of very, very astute jokes. But we use this to describe all of those situations in life where what we think we are saying is not what other people hear. And Ginger especially comes up when people have different expertise and life experiences. Because when we build up a different area of expertise, when we are exposed to different experiences in our lives, we develop different associations and intuitive understandings for abstract words and phrases. All the words we are using to describe climate change and biodiversity loss are falling in that camp. They can come to hold very different associations for different people. Now, one source of endless ginger problems is differences in professional practice, doing differences across sectors. And I'll give an example of that in a second. Now, there is science that sits behind ginger. It's not just like a fun cartoon. There are lots of branches of psychology, neuroscience that have done useful research that helps you to understand how ginger emerges. And here are just two papers of recent studies. This is in psycholinguistics, where at the start of 23, this paper appeared, and they had been looking at how people interpret very simple common nouns, nouns for animals, like chicken or penguin. And they found that at least 10 to 30 variants of word meanings exist for even common nouns like chicken or penguin. Further, people are unaware of this variation and exhibit a strong bias to erroneously believe that other people share their semantics. So we have our understanding of these words, and we don't even know that other people have a different understanding of these same words. And then this is a paper from more of the neuroscience domain, where they looked at what is the effect of emotion on semantic representation in the brain. And they found that it is especially strong when concepts are abstract and words do not have concrete or tangible meaning, which again helps you to understand something about the fights that we're getting into about these abstract words. It's not that they are simply abstract words that we don't develop an emotional response to. It's that all of us develop our own understanding of these words and then react very strongly emotionally when we run into people who disagree with us on those understandings that mean so much to us. One very, very simple, so this research wasn't about climate, but it's climate applicable. It's not because nobody has done this research about climate change so far that we can't use this insight to then help people deal with that in the real world. But I would love for people to start doing this kind of research on climate-related words. Now, one practice-based ginger example, the word risk. It really means different things in different professional sectors. If you're a scientist versus an economist versus a risk analyst sitting in a different part of the system, even versus a health professional, risk has many different clusters of meanings as well. And here's just one example. For people working on climate risk, it's the threat of bad things happening. It's the danger of climate change. That's what often is encapsulated in the words of climate risk. Now, if you're a person working in finance, then a situation of high risk is a situation of high rewards. It's an opportunity for you to make a lot of money. It is not a situation of danger and threat. So what we are seeing a lot when we are bringing economists and finance people together with climate people in the same room and they start to talk about climate risk, they are like ships sailing past each other in the night. They are not communicating well with each other. Ginger really rules the conversation there. So the take-home message here is that what we think we say is often not what other people hear, that ginger the dog can often only be managed, not resolved. You can't force economists to take on the same definition of climate risk as the climate scientists. You can just try to find your way around the miscommunication that happens when you bring them together in the room. And then the third point here is a point that I normally don't make if it's not people like yourselves, but here for this group, this is important. There's science behind ginger. This is evidence-based. But you need to make this evidence useful in society, you then need to translate that into non-disciplinary insights. And that's why we are talking about Ginger the dog and not about latent concepts or latent diversity in human concepts, which was the title of one of the papers that I mentioned before. So you really need to strip away the disciplinary language there. Okay, so final focus. Action first interventions. Now, when I started to work on climate change and started to work with people active in climate communication roles, in the climate movement, in policy working on climate, I discovered over time that there was a conventional wisdom that was present in those circles, in climate circles. Everyone working on climate change, or almost everyone working on climate change, has this idea of like, we need to raise awareness about the problem of climate change and then find ways to translate that into action. There are different flavors of that conventional wisdom. So scientists and journalists, they will say like, well, our task is to inform people, to give them information, to give them data about stuff. If you're an educator, then you will say, yeah, just giving information might not be enough. We really need to build people's awareness. We need to build their understanding through education. And then if you're a creative or if you're an activist, you might say, you know, forget about facts and forget about that education. It's really about creating an emotional response in people. That is what is really important. Now, the tragedy is that none of these flavors of the conventional wisdom are actually working very well. It's not that they don't work at all, but they just don't work very well. That's why there are big question marks there with them. Now, that conventional wisdom dominates interventions towards professional decision makers. So a lot of projects that we get involved in and a lot of people that we know are trying to do really important things in the climate space is that they are trying to give decision makers in business, finance, media, knowledge or information about the problem, and then hoping that those decision makers will go away and do something differently. That conventional wisdom also dominates discovery science in the climate comms, in the psychology, the behavioral science literature. And here's just one quote from a big review paper on climate communications that looked at the state of the field about 8 years ago. And it said appreciable advances have been made in recent years in raising climate change awareness. Despite the important progress made, persistent challenges remain. And one of the challenges that he listed was transitioning from awareness and concern into action. This isn't the only paper that makes this claim. I see this sentence again and again in the published literature. So in my 25 years as a neuroscientist, when I'm talking to people in climate, I learned that this is the conventional wisdom in practice and research, but I also learned that in real life, it often works the other way around. It's people doing something that changes our attitudes, our beliefs, our values, our feelings. And now I've introduced one of our other insights, actions drive beliefs, which is the core of the work that we are doing. We take an action-first approach with all of the people that we work with. Now, because you're scientists, because you're researchers, you're going to ask, where is the evidence for your claim? And so let's look at a few domains, a few fields that have stumbled by accident almost over the last 70 years. They've stumbled by accident on this idea that often it's the things we are doing that change the stuff that sits inside our heads. First source, cognitive dissonance research from social psychology. And here's a quote from one of the deacons of that research, Elliot Aronson. He's still alive. He's in his 90s at the moment. He was a student of Festinger back in the day. And he writes in one of his papers, prior to 1957, the general wisdom among psychologists was that if you want people to change their behavior, you must first get them to change their attitudes. Contrary to the general wisdom, dissonance theorists brashly asserted that a more powerful approach would be to induce people to change their behavior first, and their attitudes will follow. So that's what he wrote in 97. Now, the very, very interesting thing for a historian of science would be that this is also an example of how the social sciences forget very important things that they realize or discover at some point in the past. Because when I reviewed the literature on attitude and behaviors a few years ago for a paper I was writing, I saw this idea, this nugget that Elliot Aronson is talking about. I saw that in the review papers that looked at the link between attitude and behavior somewhere until the early 2000s, and then it disappears. It's not in more recent review papers that appear in annual review of psychology, etc., on the link between attitudes and behaviors. So somewhere the people writing these papers forgot about that really important insight that was discovered in the 1950s. Here is in a domain in sociology called social practice theory. There are similar insights here. This is a sentence from a sociologist called Elizabeth Shove, and she says, Consumption is an outcome of ordinary practices like heating, eating, cooling, traveling, and showering. Policymakers should therefore focus on how such practices are reproduced and how they changed. What if instead of trying to persuade individuals to use less energy and less water, you thought about the resource intensity of practices, how they take hold in society, and how they might change? So her point is like, study the behavior itself rather than the attitudes that lead to the behavior, because often people don't have attitudes about the practices that they are engaging in. They don't have attitudes about energy use until you start trying to persuade them with using less energy, and then they might actually become very polarized on this. Now, this is an example of how harmful the silos in the social sciences can be, because Elizabeth Chauve in 2011 was saying actually exactly the same as Chater and Lowenstein were saying in the I-frame versus S-frame paper that I mentioned before. But because she was sitting in sociology and those other guys were sitting in behavioral economy, it was sort of like not a thing there until the behavioral economists stumbled across it in their own rights. Third source is that in theories of predictive coding, so the most new ways that we're thinking about developing grand theories to explain how the brain operates, predictive coding, active inference, you may some of these terms, there is a real paradigm shift happening there. So this is a few sentences from a book. In the empiricist-inspired model, which is the model that a lot of psychology is using today, the brain is essentially a passive device whose job it is to perceive, evaluate sensory input, weigh their importance, and only then to decide whether and how to act. As you will see, I disagree with this perception-action outside-in model of brain operation. In the inside-out model, perception is an action-based process, an exploration initiated by the brain. Things and events in the world can acquire meaning only through brain-initiated actions. The brain does not represent the world in its numerous details, but extract those aspects that have become relevant to the organism by exploration. I really recommend anyone who has a background in neuroscience to read this book by Buzaki, The Brain from the Inside Out. It's paradigm shattering. So this is a paradigm shift in the making. If we manage to implement the kind of vision that he's talking about, we will not think about brain operation anymore in the William James way of thinking about it. We'll come to a different place. A couple of other sources of support. Gibson's affordance theory in developmental psychology. Our surroundings have action possibilities. Those action possibilities are learned through action-initiated exploration, and once they are learned, they are perceived automatically. Bandura's social learning theory, we develop our ability to act by observing and imitating others. We learn from seeing other people do. Munson's social movement research, action often precedes ideology. People often become ideological only after joining an organization. So there's a lot of thinking that goes like, people become ideological, then they join like a climate movement or an anti-abortion movement or a pro-abortion movement. No. What social movement research has shown is that it's often the other way around. It's when people join a movement, then they become really strong advocates for a cause. Kolb's experiential learning pedagogy, learning is doing plus reflection, and then lots of constructivist traditions in epistemology, sociology, psychology, neuroscience. Knowledge follows from taking action and from interacting with other people. Some of these theories may be known to you. If many of them are not known to you, then all of that is a sign of how siloed our social sciences are and our behavioral sciences are, basically. So there's really something we need to do. It's like if we were physical sciences, we would have by now forgotten Newtonian theory of gravity, basically. That's what some of these things are coming down to. So my summary, and then I will end. How can we fully leverage the sciences of brain, mind, and behavior for climate action? Many of these are calls to action to you guys as a community. The first one is by putting action first. For us individually, all of us individually, when we don't see action possibilities, when a situation doesn't trigger an action possibility in our heads, we then can't turn awareness, care, concern about a problem into action. And what that leads to, that situation leads to the polarization of climate change that we are seeing today. When you don't have an action outlet, you then turn towards becoming hopeless or hyper anxious or a denier, basically. Many different outcomes dependent on things happening in your life. But very important here is that we learn new action possibilities by doing ourselves and by seeing other people do. Those are the two main sources for all of us to develop new action possibilities. Second bullet point, focus on upstream interventions. It's often more effective to change a system in which our practices emerge than trying to persuade people to change behavior. Again, persuasion leads to polarization. There is no way around it. The more you try to persuade people, the more you will drive polarization in society. Third bullet point, let's try to get rid of the phrase behavior change and turn it into capacity building, agency building. The thing that we see in the work that we do is that professionals often don't see the action possibilities, don't have the agency to change the system. Helping them develop these action possibilities is very, very important. Fourth bullet point, we need a good balance of delivery and discovery science. Both of them are important, but at the moment we don't have enough of that delivery science. And then this is a big question to all of you behavioral scientists or people who work on that behavioral question. How could we pivot the discovery science in the behavioral sciences from mental state first towards action first approaches? I have no idea what that would look like. I've got a vague inclination that you can try to understand action possibilities that people have in their heads, and then move towards trying to understand how they think, believe, feel about climate change and their ability to take action on it. But we need to really flip around that experimental paradigm that we are using today in those behavioral sciences. All right, that's it. Lots of follow-on watching and reading material for those of you who are interested. And that's it for me.
Wow. Kris, this was amazing. It's probably one of the most insightful talks I've ever listened to. So thank you so much. Really incredible. I was taking notes of all the things I wanted to highlight, but I filled pages and pages, so I don't think I can go. But really, from anything about your talks about action first and how we can give really more agency to people, professionals, and thinking about the upstream and it's really so many great points you have. I'm gonna be quiet and let others speak and ask questions, and if I have time, I'll ask some questions too if there's enough time in the meeting. But thank you so much. This has been really incredibly insightful. Emma, please.
Hi, Kris. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, really, really interesting and inspiring talk, particularly weaving together the insights that have come from so many different people along the years and sometimes been forgotten and then resurfaced. And I've heard before, but in a much briefer context, your sort of thesis really that it's not emotion that leads to action, but action that leads to emotion change. And that's definitely been a part of what we've tried to do at the Climate Care Centre. My question is really coming down to the practicalities of when you're working with a group of policymakers who are ready and want to take action. How do you work with them to do that? So I give you the context for the question. At Climate Cares, we work a lot with policymakers. We've got a course for policymakers that really tries to showcase case studies for action, tries to show how these like win-win actions can be taken for the health of people and the planet, how they can protect their mental health working in these spaces. And we've worked with cross-sector parts of government in the UK, so across like 13 different government departments and devolved nations. And in convening these cross-sector workshops, people are really keen to take action, but it's trying to work out and trying to navigate in their context. Like we can give them the case studies, we can show them the evidence that exists, but a lot of the time there's evidence missing actually about interventions and the value of certain policies for health and mental health from a climate lens. And also it's trying to bridge within the political infrastructure and like siloed budgets, etc. There's a lot of challenges to sort of navigate. So I was just curious in your practice of, accepting that this is what we need to do and we need to help policymakers be able to take action and give them agency to do so. Could you give some tips of what that looks like when you work with policymakers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of our work is very bespoke interventions. So this is very much understanding where exactly they are stuck and then coming up with like an intervention design, which sometimes is a single workshop, sometimes is a longer program of work to help them to unravel the reasons for their stuckness and then work through that. So on the IPCC workshop example that I gave, we constructed the 2 days. We knew that everyone was stuck in a different place. Like scientists were stuck in a place, policymakers were stuck in a place. We knew we couldn't have like a very simple, like this is what you guys should be doing type of case study approach. That is good, like telling case studies, and then especially the how of how you manage to achieve something is super important. But often it is not enough because you don't know how to translate it into your own idea of stuckness. But so in that IPCC workshop, we build an experience by which out of the interactions between the scientists and the policymakers, they would make penny drop moments happen in each other's heads. And it's usually we as people sitting outside of their context, we can't tell them what they should be doing. But by creating the right context for them, they will say like, I had never thought about this thing. This is something that I can go and do. And so I will now go and do that. And then they enter that cycle of action, inspiring action. The second thing is that we are starting to more and more do training programs where we give them tools that we are using ourselves. So for example, we have systems mapping tools that then we use to identify where in the system can you intervene and where in the system should you not even try to intervene because you're going to run with your head against the brick wall. And so we are now teaching often policymakers those tools to go and apply them themselves. And we see that then builds their capacity for some of the things that we use ourselves in our work. Elizabeth?
Hi, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask if you would be willing to give an example of somebody who you've talked to who did seem to have that sense of agency and capacity. I know not everybody is lacking it. Lacking is definitely the problem, but of the people who maybe weren't trained but somehow had this sense of capacity or they were being effective, how do you think they got that way? And is there anything you've noticed that's in common between those people in terms of their thinking?
Yeah, so you need to have high levels of agency and then also an ability to cross-link agency. To go like, oh, I want to tackle this new thing and I don't know how to tackle it, but you know you've got confidence in yourself. But the second thing is that it's the actions that do it. It's like people who are not afraid to take a step, to take a next step, to experiment, to learn, to fail. Discipline hoppers, people who hop disciplines are often quite good in starting to do that more and more. Like the people that it's easiest for us to connect with are the ones who have hopped a few scientific disciplines or who hopped from science to policy or from policy to science. We often end up working with people like that. So that seems to create a bit of mental agility where they can then just say like, yeah, I know I've done this before in this domain. I'm now going to do it in this other domain. I'll give you one example. There's someone we work with in an organization, and he came from the accountancy world. And in the accountancy world, he was responsible for bringing in a really new way to think about how do you bring sustainability into accounting. And that it's called integrated reporting. That approach is sort of like being used these days by a lot of places. But then he was getting disappointed by the change that was coming from that. And he started this new organization where he said, like, I need to work out how to do systems change. And so that's what he's doing today. We are working with him. We are helping them still because they, like, even people with high levels of agency then don't have all of the insight, the tools that they might put to use to then want to achieve their aims. But that is an example of someone who had made the transition and was very successful in the things that he was doing. Elon?
Hi. Okay. Well, thank you for a wonderful talk. It was a tour de force. I don't say that lightly. I like all the talks that have come so far have been fantastic, but this one really covered a lot of ground. I sort of noted some things down as we went along, and then some issues. And I think it's a really important talk for the group as a whole. The things that I noted were just like, yes, yes, where the fact that you're talking about noun boundary, the action-based agency. Oh my gosh, our whole book, we're trying to think about agency and how to do solutions. So solution-based. The fact that you're at least hinting that academia is impeding the issues, is just fantastic. The flipping the causalities, how brains, affect the environment, the policy aspect. I just have more the systems. Anybody who puts up a Far Side, comic is gonna, get points. But that's a really good that. And one more thing that you said is a really good segue to the issues. And the other thing was the ruffling feathers. So I'm going to use your Far Side comic and the ruffling issues. I'm going to sort of present it as my opinion, but it's but frame, take it as a question, and I'd love to hear your feedback on it. So the points that sort of troubled me were, first of all, the focus on climate change. And I brought this to the group, and this is sort of the segue that I'm hoping to sort of, again, every time the talks come in, I jump in and I say, wait, let's think about the climate change. The second we set up a climate change, or we just focus on climate change, we're setting ourselves up. For the first, for the most part, I mean, there's climate change might actually, I know people are going to sort of think, oh my God, and I'm ruffling feathers myself, is going to, really, it might benefit certain areas. If you're living in Upper Canada, suddenly you can plant stuff or whatever. So it's, I don't want to be sort of overly, poke the thing, but the point is that when you make it sort of anthropocentric, you're going to set yourself up for problems. The next one is the health benefits. All of these sort of relate. The second you think about the problem with the health model and having solutions is that we have huge problems with the health model, right? I mean, the biggest problem,
Absolutely.
one of the biggest problems we have is that there's interest, which brings me to the third point and to the far side. So on the talk, I posted, the next far side in that series, which was the discussion with the cat and what the cat hears, which is nothing. And it's not because cats are stupid, it's because they're not interested, which is not exactly gets to my point. The point is not that they don't have interest, but the point is that, and you sort of touched on this when you talked about, when you speak to, whether it's politicians or people in industry, what they're hearing is, I can make a lot of money on this. Oh my God, and this is something that I don't think we've tackled yet, right? Which is climate anxiety is a huge boon for pharmaceutical industries. So if we step into that, we could become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The last couple of things, and I'll wrap it up, is we really need to set an example, right? So when we, as a group, as individuals, if we engage the same problems that, so for example, when you talked about Buzaki, this is where I come from, is neuroscience or whatever. Buzaki spent decades, doing rat models, which is where I came from. But that's not this, that's more the solution to where we're going wrong to where we're going right. So, what I would be looking for, and I think it was Elizabeth that asked the question, do you have an example? I'm thinking somebody like Rachel Carson, right? And basically, completely changing how we think about the environment. So, uh, and that brings me to the sort of wrapping it up. In terms of action, and this is where you started with the polarization, I'm not so sure that we should be worried about polarization, right? Because if you take a look at like Kuhnian theory and paradigm changes, it comes from polarization, right? So people like Rachel Carson started a movement, but they were alone at the beginning, right? So how do we create a movement that gets people to join? And if you're right, I think it's probably sort of a recurrent thing, but if people are going to join and then have the emotion and action, how do we make sure we build something that's actually going to lead to the right solutions, to the right examples, not more animal research, not more pharmaceuticals, not more whatever, but actually, planting more trees or something like that. So sorry, I threw a lot, but it's your fault. You gave a really good talk. So.
one point that I want to pick up on from the many things that you've said, and yes, that this warrants deeper discussion, but we call ourselves a climate action unit, but we work on any environmental and any integrated any issues that is linked to climate change. So like environmental stuff, biodiversity, nature, projects come our way that sit in that domain. But most of our work is on climate policy and climate action. Yeah. Parajita?
Hello, it was such an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. So, I work with a lot of people and especially children in India who are below poverty line. And I am pretty sure that um, it's not about India. There are a lot of people like this around the world. So, can you give me an example where you may have worked with or you have some agency to like help this population to take climate friendly action? Because one of the important thing is it's very difficult to give the basic education to these people, and it is I should repeat that it is not about the children, it comes with their parents and everybody. So in any part of the world, if it is happening, or is there any group is working on this? So if you want to enlighten.
Yeah, I'll give very quick examples. The first one is that I've got a friend of mine is a professor in Rwanda at a university there, and he started up a project that he calls One Child, One Tree, which is he's got this project where he gets school kids to plant a tree and then care for their tree. So it's not just like random tree planting and then disappear and then nobody looks after the forest and it gets cut. No, this is really a place where you get the kids involved, you get the whole community involved, you plant a local forest, you get the kids to care for the forest. That works for everyone in those communities, also many of them below the poverty line, etc. Something that might then be more for what direction do you send the people in that you're working in, the young kids that you're working with? Some years ago, we had an Indian student come to UCL from India, and she was working with us for a while, and then she went back to India, and she started something what she called the Climapreneur podcast, which was a podcast where she was interviewing local entrepreneurs in how they were building small, medium businesses on doing something about environmental issues. And she has a host of them now on her website. But more importantly, recently she started an incubator for new projects. So this is one example where action leads to further action, because she's now not only telling the stories of action anymore, she's creating new stories of action. And she's going around, I think she's focusing on one state in India at the moment, but she's going around communities, finding opportunities to scale up action and then putting that into reality.
Fantastic.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all this. So yeah, we will obviously looking into this. And I also have a One Tree, One Children program, but yeah, we can have this incredible idea to work that whole community looks into it and takes care of it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
I can put you in contact with the guy who's doing it in Rwanda.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, if you reach out to me afterwards.
I will. Yeah. Thank you.
Kim.
Bridget, do I have time for one more question?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. Hey, Kris, thanks so much for this talk. It was really interesting. I was talking with some people in the background. Like, you touched on so many different ideas and so many thought processes that have been going on in my mind, and I think have been discussed in the field a lot over the last 5-ish years. So I really appreciate that. But I'm actually going to riff on Emma's comment in the chat, because I think it is really something important that I wanted to get your opinion on. By the way, I was also talking with some people in the background, and being like, I would love to take you for a beer, and like we can sit down and have like a behind the scenes conversation at some point. But basically, so Emma's question was, what policies would you put in place that do you think would be most helpful upstream to enable widespread behavior change that leads to reduced emissions with minimal disruption and pushback? And I think that is kind of the key thing where I personally think that behavioral science and behavior change science can make a huge impact, right? We know that policies don't get passed, especially in the climate domain, a policy won't get enacted unless if it has the support of the people. So, like, how can we target these kind of upstream policies and ignoring a lot of the attitudes and the beliefs? I think I'm like, half of my brain is very much on your side and completely convinced, and the other half of my brain is like, no, I think that there's a lot more nuance here that kind of needs to be ironed out and worked out. And this is also what I mentioned in my email before, where I'm totally on your side and also not on your side at the same time.
Yeah, we can work out the nuance in the coming weeks and months. Very quickly, we have a brilliant example of a policy that made very, very, very upstream interventions that makes Emma's thing possible. Inflation Reduction Act is the best example that we have to date of an upstream intervention. And it was so far upstream that actually the Democrats lost the election on climate change because they couldn't make the case that it was a climate policy. But it was the most brilliant climate policy that has been enacted, certainly by the US to date. Other countries have done similar things, sometimes smaller in size. But that's an example of an upstream intervention. One place that we have gone even a little bit further upstream is that we've worked with energy modelers who were saying most of the policy world overestimates the cost of transitioning towards a clean energy system and therefore are resisting to bring in certain kinds of change. And so we helped these economists and energy modelers to tell their story better. So we really helped them to communicate better about the work that they were doing. But they wrote an energy report that then was more influential, received less pushback, less rejection from the policymakers they were speaking to. They're writing their papers in a different way than they used to be. So that's how far upstream you can think of driving these interventions.
It's really interesting that you say that because indeed, in my mind, I kind of think, so coming back to our big study, right? We talk about behavior change in that context, but really the vast majority of interventions that we use there and that are used regularly in my mind are different ways of framing a very similar subject, right? It's different ways. It is intervention science, but it is actually more coming back to this idea that you mentioned in the beginning about being able to speak a language that everybody would be able to understand, but also be able to digest, right? And this is why I'm also a big proponent that one of the best ways to fight climate change is to not fight climate change. Remove climate change from everybody's vocabulary and talk about all of these other, like the Inflation Act, right? Talking about these things that as a just added bonus happen to fight climate change, but let's take it from a different angle, right?
Yes,
Sorry, I will stop talking
absolutely.
now.
Yeah, it's not that everyone, I mean, there's, of course, we will still keep on talking about climate change, but in the end, you need to talk about the problems you are solving for people. And that is different across different value groups. And here's where the psychology of values comes in, etc. So different groups will respond to different kinds of descriptions and messages and all of that. But you really need to talk about like what problem you're solving for people and how that will lead to good outcomes for them. And so I often say, like, let's make the story about how we are creating a better world for everyone, not in that abstract way, but targeting that message in different ways to different groups. And one of the side effects of that will be that we tackle climate change. So one of the problems that has happened in this awareness to action space is that all the policymakers, the people working on this, thought like, okay, so it's really difficult to get decision makers to act on climate change. We'll therefore try to sell the co-benefits of action on climate change. You should flip it around. You should say, we're solving big problems in society, and one of the co-benefits of that will be that we're acting on climate change. Okay, Giotti, you're on mute, sorry.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you for a really amazing talk. I know we're over time. I'm just curious about you mentioned that you had some workshops slash training tools that you use to work with policymakers to drive greater action, and whether such tools are shareable. And if they are, we would love to help disseminate in our own communities with leaders.
Yeah, that is a great question, and we're running behind on having things packaged up and written up in a way that it's easily shareable because we're so often pulled into doing project work and going to solve problems. My colleague John's smiling there because he knows how our organization is running completely hot at the moment. But there are some things that are written down, and I will share those with Burçin. Some of them are already in the presentation with clickable links. And then anything that we like any so I really joined this group when Burçin reached out to me. And so we can continue to talk about how do we bring those even into your strategy development, because last week you were talking about strategy development. Well, strategy development happens to be one of the things that we do with the tools that we have. So maybe there's a learning by doing here that can happen as well.
Absolutely. I love that idea. And when you were talking about also that lack of agency and so on, that really brought up a lot of what I'm hearing in conversations with young people, especially feeling climate anxiety, that they feel like they're looking for action. They want to be part of a group, part of collective. We see in our studies, Josh Cross and so when they present the collective action seems to be the antidote of climate anxiety, yet there's so little tools out there to be able to give those kind of empowerment, that kind of actionable solutions to young people's hands too. So that would be great to be able to reflect that onto young people as well.
Yes.
And
All right.
welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us too. Please feel free to contact me afterwards if you want to be part of this group. We would love to have you aboard as well. Thank you so much. We are 15 minutes past, but this conversation was so incredible. Thank you, Kris, really for joining us today and for these incredible insights you have shared with us. And thank you all for joining. And we'll see
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining. I think maybe some people maybe had left but did not stop. But thank you so much, Dr. Mann, again for your points and for being here really late. Your time, really appreciate you being there. Thank you. Aparajita, I'll close it and then re-enter. Why don't we re-enter to this room in like
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Right.